Imagine waking up before sunrise in a cold medieval castle. The room is dark. The only light comes from a small candle burning in the corner. Outside, the wind whistles through the stone walls, and somewhere in the distance, guards are changing shifts. Your bed is better than most people's, but that doesn't mean it's comfortable. The mattress is filled with feathers instead of straw, because you are a princess. Heavy blankets cover your body, and a servant placed a pan of heated stones under the blankets hours ago. They have already gone cold. You are only 8 years old, but your future has already been decided. You don't get to choose who you will marry. You don't get to choose where you will live. You don't even get to choose what your life will become. Kings have already discussed your future. Noblemen have signed agreements. Alliances have been planned. Everyone knows your destiny, except you. If you were born a medieval princess, you were never truly free. You were one of the most valuable political tools your family possessed. Every smile, every lesson, every dress, every conversation prepared you for one purpose: to strengthen your father's kingdom. Love was never part of the plan. When noble families looked at a princess, they didn't see a little girl. They saw castles, land, armies, power. And the older you became, the more valuable you were. Some princesses were promised in marriage before they could even speak clearly. Others were engaged before they understood what marriage meant. By the age of 12, many girls were already expected to leave their families forever and move to a foreign kingdom. That wasn't considered unusual. It was completely normal. Today, we're going to step inside the life of one remarkable princess, Joan of Acre. She was born into one of the most powerful royal families in Europe. Her father was King Edward I of England, a warrior king, a conqueror, a ruler feared across Britain. Her mother was Eleanor of Castile, a queen known for her intelligence, education, and remarkable strength. Joan entered a world where survival itself was uncertain. Her mother would become pregnant around 16 times during her life. Yet only a handful of those children survived into adulthood. Disease, fever, and childhood illnesses claimed royal children just as easily as the children of peasants. Being born in a palace did not protect anyone from death. Joan survived. And because she survived, she became valuable. Very valuable. From the day she was born, her future belonged to politics. But there was something unusual about Joan. Unlike many princesses who quietly accepted their fate, Joan had a stubborn spirit. She questioned things. She spoke her mind. She wasn't afraid to disagree with people much older than herself. Nobody knew it yet. But this little girl would one day challenge one of the most powerful kings in Europe, her own father. Before that happened, however, Joan had to experience childhood. Although calling it a normal childhood would be completely wrong, because medieval princesses didn't spend their lives in one beautiful castle. Instead, they lived on the road.
Life on the road was normal for England's royal family. Unlike modern kings and queens, medieval monarchs rarely stayed in one palace for very long. Instead, they traveled constantly from castle to castle across the kingdom. There were many reasons for this. One reason was practical. A single castle could not feed hundreds of royal servants for months at a time. By moving from one estate to another, the king allowed each location time to recover its food supplies. Another reason was political. The king wanted his people to see him. Noble families expected royal visits, and local officials needed to be reminded that the crown was always watching. For little Joan, this meant there was never a permanent home. One month she might sleep inside a massive stone fortress. A few weeks later she could be staying in a wooden manor surrounded by forests. Then the royal family would continue traveling once again. Every journey was long, slow, and exhausting. The roads were rough and often little more than muddy paths. Heavy rain could turn them into deep rivers of mud. Horses struggled to pull wagons, and travelers sometimes spent entire days moving only a few miles. Bandits also posed a danger. Although the king traveled with soldiers, attacks were always possible. Scouts rode ahead to inspect the roads, while armed guards protected the royal family from every direction. Even with protection, travel was uncomfortable. Cold winds blew through open carriages, dust covered clothes during the summer, while freezing rain soaked travelers during winter. Yet this was simply part of royal life. Joan quickly became used to it. As she grew older, her education became more serious. Unlike boys, who trained mainly for war and leadership, princesses followed a different path. Every morning began with lessons. She learned to read religious books. She practiced writing elegant letters. She studied French, the language spoken by many nobles across Europe. She memorized prayers and passages from the Bible. Teachers also instructed her in music. She learned to sing beautifully, play simple instruments, and appreciate poetry. But education was about much more than knowledge. She had to master perfect manners, how to greet nobles, how to bow gracefully, how to walk with confidence, even how to sit at a banquet without embarrassing the royal family. Every movement mattered. Servants watched, tutors corrected mistakes immediately. Nothing was considered too small. Joan also learned practical skills expected from noblewomen. She practiced embroidery for hours. She learned how to manage servants. She observed how her mother organized household accounts and supervised hundreds of workers. One day, these responsibilities would become her own. Her mother, Queen Eleanor, became Joan's greatest example. Eleanor was far more than a beautiful queen. She traveled beside King Edward during military campaigns. She advised him on important matters. She managed vast estates and handled financial affairs with remarkable skill. Joan admired her deeply. Watching her mother taught Joan that strength was not limited to men. A woman could influence kingdoms without ever carrying a sword. Still, beneath the lessons and royal ceremonies, Joan remained a child. She laughed with her brothers and sisters. She enjoyed stories told by traveling musicians. She chased pets through castle courtyards whenever servants weren't looking. For a few precious moments, she could forget that she was a princess. But childhood never lasted long in the Middle Ages. As Joan approached the age of 4, powerful men across Europe had already begun discussing her future. Not her education, not her happiness, her marriage. Without asking her opinion, negotiations quietly began between England and one of the most influential families in Europe. Joan had no idea that her life was about to change forever, and the journey ahead would take her farther from home than she could ever imagine. Without warning, strong winds often delayed ships for days. Passengers became seasick as waves crashed against the wooden vessels. There were no comfortable cabins, no engines, no modern navigation systems, only sails, ropes, and experienced sailors hoping the weather remained favorable. After safely reaching France, Joan entered an entirely different world. Although England's royal family already spoke French at court, life in France still felt unfamiliar. The castles looked different, the customs were slightly different, the people spoke with accents she had never heard before. Fortunately, Joan was welcomed into the household of her grandmother, Queen Joan of Navarre. There she received excellent care and education. She was surrounded by noble ladies, experienced tutors, priests, musicians, and servants who ensured she lacked nothing. Compared to ordinary medieval children, her life was filled with luxury. She wore fine clothing made from soft wool and expensive fabrics. Her meals included fresh bread, roasted meat, fruit, and imported spices that most people would never taste. She slept in warm chambers decorated with colorful tapestries that covered the cold stone walls. Yet, even surrounded by comfort, one feeling remained. She missed home. She missed England. She missed her father. She missed her mother. Letters traveled slowly across Europe. Months could pass before news arrived. Sometimes ships carrying messages disappeared during storms. Sometimes messengers were robbed before reaching their destination. A child living hundreds of miles away could easily feel forgotten. Joan learned to become independent. She adapted quickly to her new surroundings. She made friends among the young nobles living at the French court. She became fluent in French and gained confidence with every passing year. Those around her noticed something unusual. Unlike many royal children who became quiet and obedient, Joan developed a strong personality. She asked questions. She defended her opinions. She showed remarkable intelligence for her age. No one could imagine that this confident young princess would one day make a decision so shocking that it would challenge the authority of the King of England himself. But before that could happen, tragedy was about to strike the royal family, a tragedy that would change Joan's life forever.
For several years, Joan continued her life in France. She grew taller, she became wiser, and with each passing year she slowly transformed from a little girl into a confident young princess. Life at her grandmother's court was peaceful compared to the constant traveling she had known in England. Every day followed a familiar routine. Morning prayers echoed through the chapel, lessons filled the early hours. Afternoons were spent practicing music, reading, embroidery, and learning the complex rules of noble society. Joan excelled in almost everything she studied. Her tutors often praised her quick mind and excellent memory. She learned how kingdoms were governed. She studied the histories of famous rulers. She observed how noble families negotiated alliances and settled disputes without drawing swords. Although she was still young, she understood that words could be just as powerful as weapons. But while Joan was growing and learning in France, heartbreaking news arrived from England. Her mother, Queen Eleanor of Castile, had fallen seriously ill. For many years, Eleanor had traveled beside King Edward during military campaigns and royal journeys. The endless travel had exhausted her body. After giving birth to many children throughout her life, her health had become increasingly fragile. In the autumn of 1290, Queen Eleanor died. She was only 49 years old. The news spread quickly across Europe. When Joan learned that her mother was gone, she was devastated. She had not seen Eleanor for years. There would be no final goodbye, no last embrace, only memories.
King Edward I was overwhelmed with grief. Although history remembers him as a fierce warrior and powerful ruler, those closest to him witnessed a different side after Eleanor's death. He mourned deeply. As her funeral procession traveled toward London, Edward ordered magnificent stone crosses to be built at every place where her coffin rested overnight. These monuments became known as the Eleanor Crosses. Even today, some of them still stand as reminders of his love and sorrow. For Joan, however, no monument could replace a mother. The loss changed her forever. She became quieter for a time, more thoughtful. She understood something many children never consider. Royal blood did not protect anyone from death, not even queens. Life could change in a single moment. Despite the family's grief, politics never stopped. Kings could not pause their duties because of personal tragedy. Important decisions still had to be made. Wars continued, treaties continued, marriage negotiations continued. Joan's future remained one of the king's highest priorities. By now she was entering her teenage years. Across Europe, noble families began paying even closer attention to her. She was no longer simply a royal child. She was becoming one of England's most valuable princesses. Her education had prepared her well. She could read and write fluently. She spoke French with ease. She understood court etiquette better than many adults. She knew how to host noble guests, manage servants, and represent the dignity of the English crown. Everything seemed ready for the next stage of her life. Then, one morning, an official message arrived from England. It carried the king's royal seal. Joan was being summoned home. After years of living in France, her childhood was finally coming to an end. The little girl who had left England years earlier would return as a young woman. But she had no idea that the future waiting for her would be filled with unexpected choices, dangerous political games, and a love story that would shock the entire kingdom. After years away from her homeland, Joan finally returned to England. The journey across the English Channel felt strangely familiar. As the ship approached the white cliffs of England, she stood on the deck watching the coastline slowly come into view. This was the country where she had been born, yet it no longer felt completely like home. She had spent so many years in France that many of its customs had become part of her daily life. Now she had to adjust once again. When Joan arrived at the royal court, she was no longer the little girl her father remembered. She had grown into a graceful and intelligent young woman. Her confidence impressed everyone who met her. King Edward I welcomed his daughter warmly. Although he was known throughout Europe as a strict and powerful ruler, he was proud of Joan's education and maturity. Still, their reunion was not simply a family gathering. The king had important plans. Joan's return meant that the marriage negotiations could finally move forward. The agreement that had been made years earlier was about to become reality. The man chosen to marry Joan was Gilbert de Clare, the powerful Earl of Gloucester. He was one of the wealthiest noblemen in England. His lands stretched across several counties. His castles guarded important borders. His private army numbered in the thousands. To King Edward, this marriage would strengthen the kingdom and secure the loyalty of one of his greatest nobles. There was just one problem. Gilbert was much older than Joan. More than 30 years separated them. By modern standards, the age difference is shocking. But in medieval Europe, political marriages like this were common among the nobility. Personal feelings were rarely considered. Joan understood what was expected of her. She had been trained for this role since childhood. Every lesson, every ceremony, and every rule she had learned pointed toward this single moment. In 1290, the marriage officially took place. The wedding was celebrated with great ceremony. Nobles from across England attended. Church bells rang throughout the city. Lavish feasts filled the great halls with music, laughter, and endless courses of food. To the outside world, it looked like the perfect royal marriage. But behind the celebrations, reality was more complicated. Joan was still very young. She was entering a completely new life beside a husband who had already spent decades involved in politics and war. As the Countess of Gloucester, Joan suddenly carried enormous responsibilities. She managed large households, she supervised servants, she welcomed important guests, she represented one of the most influential families in England. Fortunately, Gilbert treated her with respect. Although their marriage had been arranged for political reasons, historical records suggest that he valued Joan's intelligence and trusted her judgment. Over the next few years, Joan settled into her new role. She gave birth to children who would continue both royal bloodlines. Each birth strengthened the alliance between the crown and the powerful Clare family. For a time, life appeared stable. England was relatively peaceful. Joan fulfilled every duty expected of a medieval noblewoman. Many people believed her future was now secure. But fate often changes when no one expects it. Only a few years after their marriage, Gilbert de Clare became seriously ill. Despite the best efforts of physicians and prayers offered in churches across the kingdom, his condition continued to worsen. Then, in 1295, tragedy struck once again. Gilbert died. Joan was left a widow. She was only in her early 20s. With several young children depending on her, Joan suddenly faced an uncertain future. Most people assumed that King Edward would quickly arrange another political marriage for his daughter. After all, she was still young, wealthy, and one of the highest-ranking women in England. But this time, Joan had plans of her own, plans that no one, not even the King of England, could have imagined. The death of Gilbert de Clare changed Joan's life overnight. One day, she had been the wife of one of England's most powerful noblemen. The next, she was a young widow with several small children and enormous responsibilities. In medieval society, widows were expected to mourn their husbands for a period of time. Joan did exactly that. She wore dark clothing. She attended religious services. She prayed for Gilbert's soul, as tradition required. But behind the quiet ceremonies, another reality was unfolding. Joan was now one of the wealthiest women in England. Through her late husband's estates and her royal blood, she possessed great influence. Powerful noblemen quickly realized that marrying Joan could bring immense wealth, land, and political connections. Before long, new marriage proposals began arriving. Some came from ambitious lords. Others were quietly discussed between noble families. Everyone assumed the final decision would belong to one person, King Edward I. As Joan's father and as the King of England, Edward believed he had the right to choose her next husband. This was completely normal in medieval Europe. Royal daughters rarely selected their own husbands. Their marriages served the interests of the kingdom, not personal happiness. Edward immediately began considering suitable candidates. He wanted another alliance that would strengthen England's political position. Perhaps another powerful earl, perhaps even a foreign prince. Whatever the choice, it would certainly benefit the crown. But while the king searched for the perfect husband, Joan was keeping a dangerous secret. During the years after Gilbert's death, she had become close to a young knight named Ralph de Monthermer. Unlike the wealthy noble seeking her hand, Ralph came from a much more modest background. He was brave, honest, loyal. He served in Joan's household and earned respect through his character rather than his family name. The more time they spent together, the stronger their feelings became. For the first time in her life, Joan experienced something she had never been allowed to consider before: real love. There were no political negotiations, no royal treaties, no discussions about land or castles. Only two people who genuinely cared for one another. Joan knew the relationship was dangerous. Her father would never approve. A princess marrying an ordinary knight would be seen as an insult to the royal family. It could weaken political alliances. It could embarrass the king before the entire European nobility. Still, Joan refused to ignore her heart. She and Ralph continued meeting in secret. Every conversation carried enormous risk. If servants reported what they saw, if a noble overheard their plans, everything could be destroyed. Months passed. Their love only grew stronger. Eventually, they reached a decision that would change history. Rather than asking for the king's permission, they would marry in secret. It was an astonishing act of courage, or perhaps an act of desperation. They knew the consequences could be severe. Edward was famous for his strict discipline. He punished nobles who disobeyed him. He expected absolute loyalty from everyone, including his own children. Yet Joan believed that this time her own happiness mattered more than politics. The quiet ceremony took place away from the eyes of the royal court. No grand cathedral, no magnificent feast, no gathering of Europe's greatest nobles, only a small group of trusted witnesses. When the vows were spoken, Joan became Ralph's wife. For the first time in her life, she had made her own choice. It was the happiest day she had ever known. But happiness built on secrecy cannot remain hidden forever. Soon, King Edward would discover the truth, and when he did, his anger would shake the entire kingdom.
For a short time, Joan and Ralph believed their secret was safe. They lived quietly, keeping their marriage hidden from the royal court. Only a handful of trusted people knew the truth. Every day felt like borrowed time. Whenever a royal messenger arrived, Joan's heart raced. Whenever someone asked unexpected questions, Ralph feared they had been discovered. But secrets rarely remain hidden for long, especially inside a medieval court. Castles were full of servants, guards, priests, and noble visitors. People noticed everything. A whispered conversation, a secret meeting, a missing document. Rumors spread faster than official announcements. Eventually, word reached King Edward I. At first, he refused to believe it. His daughter, a princess of England, had secretly married a simple knight without asking his permission. It seemed impossible. The king ordered an immediate investigation. Trusted officials questioned servants and gathered evidence. Before long, the truth became undeniable. Joan had secretly married Ralph de Monthermer. Edward's anger was explosive. He was not simply a disappointed father. He was the King of England.
To him, Joan's actions were more than personal disobedience. They were a direct challenge to royal authority. If a princess ignored the king's command, what message would that send to the rest of the kingdom? Edward believed discipline had to be maintained. No one, not even his own daughter, could place personal wishes above the interests of the crown. Without hesitation, the king acted. Ralph was arrested. Royal guards seized him and placed him in prison. The young knight who had dared to marry a princess suddenly found himself locked behind thick stone walls. His future looked hopeless. Many feared the punishment would be severe. Some even whispered that he might never be released. Meanwhile, King Edward confiscated Joan's lands and estates. The wealth she controlled was taken under royal authority. It was both a punishment and a warning. The king hoped pressure would force Joan to admit her mistake. Instead, she did something no one expected. Rather than denying the marriage, she openly defended it. Joan requested permission to speak with her father. When they finally met, the room was filled with tension. Powerful noblemen stood nearby. Royal advisors waited silently. Everyone expected the princess to beg for forgiveness. Instead, Joan stood tall. She looked directly at the king. Then she spoke with remarkable courage. She reminded her father that powerful noblemen often married women beneath their social rank. When men did it, society accepted the decision. So why should the rules be different for a woman? Why should a princess be denied the same freedom? Her words stunned the court. Very few people dared to question King Edward. Even fewer challenged him with logic instead of emotion. Joan remained calm. She did not raise her voice. She simply defended the man she loved. For a moment, the great hall fell silent. The king had faced countless enemies on the battlefield. He had defeated armies. He had conquered castles. But now he faced something entirely different: his own daughter's determination. Edward was still furious, yet deep inside he could see that Joan would not change her mind. She had chosen love over politics, and she was prepared to face every consequence. The question now was simple. Would the king destroy her daughter's happiness, or would one of the most powerful rulers in Europe finally give in? The answer would surprise the entire kingdom.
The entire royal court waited for King Edward's decision. No one dared to speak. The great hall, usually filled with conversation and laughter, was silent. Every noble understood the importance of this moment. If the king forgave Joan, some would see it as weakness. If he refused, he risked losing the trust and love of his own daughter. Edward spent days considering his options. His advisers urged him to stand firm. "A king cannot allow his authority to be challenged," some argued. "If your majesty accepts this marriage, other nobles may believe they can ignore your commands as well." Others offered different advice. "Joan has already married Ralph," they reminded the king. "Punishing them forever will not undo what has been done." The decision weighed heavily on Edward. He loved his daughter, but he also believed that the law and the authority of the crown must be respected.
Meanwhile, Ralph remained in prison. His cell was cold and damp. The thick stone walls blocked out sunlight. Days turned into weeks. He had no way of knowing whether he would ever be free again. Yet he never denied his love for Joan. He knew the risks when they married. If he had the chance to choose again, he would make the same decision. Joan also refused to surrender. She continued writing letters to her father. In each letter, she respectfully defended her marriage. She never insulted the king. She never demanded forgiveness. Instead, she reminded him that loyalty and love could exist together. She promised that Ralph would serve the English crown faithfully if given the opportunity. Slowly, Edward's anger began to soften. Perhaps he realized that keeping Ralph imprisoned would only deepen the divide within the royal family. Perhaps he admired Joan's courage, even if he disagreed with her actions. Or perhaps beneath the armor of a warrior king, he was still a father who could not bear to see his daughter unhappy. Finally, the king made his decision. Ralph de Monthermer was released from prison. The news spread rapidly across England. Many people could hardly believe it. Even more surprising, Edward officially recognized the marriage. Although he had fiercely opposed it at first, he accepted Ralph as Joan's husband. It was an extraordinary outcome. The king even restored Joan's lands and titles. In time, Ralph himself was granted important responsibilities and noble status through his marriage to Joan. He proved himself to be loyal, capable, and brave. He served the king in military campaigns and carried out royal duties with dedication. Little by little, Edward's opinion of his son-in-law improved. The man he had once imprisoned became someone he could trust. For Joan, it was a remarkable victory. She had not won through violence. She had not gathered an army. She had not started a rebellion. She had won with patience, honesty, and unwavering determination. In a time when most royal women had little control over their own lives, Joan had defended her right to choose her husband. Her story became one of the rare examples of a rare medieval princess successfully standing up to a king and changing his mind. But Joan's life was far from over. More challenges still awaited her. Political tensions continued to grow across England. Her family would soon become divided by new conflicts, and before long, Joan would once again find herself caught between love, loyalty, and the demands of the English crown.
After the king accepted Joan's marriage, life finally became peaceful once again. For the first time in many years, Joan was living the life she had chosen for herself. She was no longer simply a princess following royal orders. She was a wife, a mother, and a woman who had proven that courage could sometimes overcome even the greatest authority. Ralph de Monthermer adapted quickly to his new position. Although many nobles had once looked down on him because of his humble birth, he worked hard to earn their respect. He joined military campaigns for the king. He managed estates responsibly. He treated Joan with kindness and remained loyal to both his family and the English crown. Gradually, even those who had criticized their marriage began to change their opinions. People realized that Ralph was not seeking power for selfish reasons. He simply wanted to build an honest life with the woman he loved.
Joan also continued to fulfill her duties as a noblewoman. She supervised large households, she managed servants and estates, she ensured that her lands remained productive and well governed. These responsibilities were enormous. Hundreds of workers depended on good leadership. Fields had to be planted, harvests had to be stored, taxes had to be collected fairly, disputes among tenants needed careful judgment. Joan handled these tasks with remarkable confidence. Her years of education in France and England had prepared her well. She proved that noble women were capable administrators, not merely decorative figures at court. At home, Joan and Ralph welcomed more children into their growing family. Despite the pressures of royal life, they created a household filled with warmth and affection. Unlike Joan's first marriage, this relationship had been built on mutual respect and genuine love. It became the happiest chapter of her life. But peace rarely lasted long during the reign of King Edward I. Beyond the walls of castles, England faced growing political unrest. The king was becoming older. His long military campaigns had exhausted the kingdom. Taxes increased to pay for expensive wars in Scotland and elsewhere. Some nobles began questioning the king's decisions. Others worried about the future of the royal family. At the center of these concerns stood Joan's younger brother, Prince Edward, the future King Edward II. Unlike his father, Prince Edward had a gentle personality. He preferred companionship, tournaments, and courtly life over endless warfare. Many experienced nobles doubted whether he possessed the strength needed to rule England after his father's death. These doubts created tension throughout the kingdom. Joan watched these events carefully. She loved her brother deeply. Growing up, they had shared many memories despite spending years apart. Now she saw him struggling beneath the enormous expectations placed upon him. As both a sister and a princess, Joan found herself caught between two people she loved, her father and her brother. She respected King Edward's authority, but she also understood that the future king deserved loyalty and support. This delicate balance became increasingly difficult to maintain. Every decision carried political consequences. Every family disagreement attracted the attention of powerful nobles. Joan had already challenged her father once. She hoped never to face such conflict again. Unfortunately, history had different plans. The final years of King Edward's reign would test the royal family like never before. Old loyalties would be questioned. New rivalries would emerge. And Joan would once again be forced to choose between obedience to the crown and loyalty to the people she loved. The greatest challenges of her remarkable life were still waiting just beyond the horizon.
As the years passed, King Edward I grew older. The great warrior who had spent decades leading armies across Britain no longer possessed the same strength he once had. His body carried the scars of countless campaigns. His hair had turned grey, yet his determination remained as strong as ever. Even in old age, Edward refused to slow down. He continued planning military expeditions, especially against Scotland, where resistance to English rule refused to disappear. The kingdom admired his courage, but many also worried. The king's health was declining, and everyone knew that one day the crown would pass to his only surviving son, Prince Edward. Inside the royal court, conversations quietly shifted toward the future. Who would guide the young prince? Would the nobles remain loyal after the old king died? Could England remain united? Joan listened carefully to these discussions. She had spent her entire life surrounded by politics. She understood that uncertainty often created danger. Although she rarely interfered publicly, she watched events closely. Her brother, Prince Edward, faced increasing criticism. Some nobles believed he lacked his father's military spirit. Others disliked the friends who surrounded the prince. They feared these companions held too much influence over the future king. King Edward himself became frustrated. He expected discipline, courage, and complete dedication to the kingdom. Whenever the prince failed to meet those expectations, arguments followed. Their relationship became strained. Father and son often disagreed over matters of leadership and responsibility. Joan found herself in an uncomfortable position. She loved them both. Her father had forgiven her greatest mistake and accepted the man she loved. Her brother had always treated her with kindness and respect. Now the two most important men in her family were growing farther apart. Whenever possible, Joan encouraged peace. She avoided taking sides publicly. She understood that open disagreement within the royal family could encourage ambitious nobles to create even greater divisions. Meanwhile, her own household continued to flourish. Ralph proved himself to be an able nobleman. He successfully managed the estates entrusted to him and served the crown faithfully. Their children were growing quickly. Joan devoted time to their education, determined to give them the same opportunities she had received. She taught them the importance of honesty. She reminded them that titles alone did not make someone honorable. Character mattered far more than wealth or power. These lessons reflected her own life. She had married for love instead of political advantage. She had challenged a king with respect instead of anger. She wanted her children to understand that courage should always be guided by wisdom. But outside the peaceful walls of her home, England remained uneasy. The Scottish wars continued. Royal finances were under pressure. Many nobles argued over taxes and military service. Every new campaign demanded more money, more soldiers, and greater sacrifice. The people were growing tired. Even the strongest kingdoms could not wage endless wars without consequences. As King Edward prepared for another campaign against Scotland, few realized that it would become the final chapter of his remarkable reign. The aging king was determined to march north once more, but fate had other plans. Soon, news would spread across England that would change the kingdom forever. The death of a legendary king would mark the beginning of a new era, and Joan would soon witness the rise of a new monarch, her own brother.
The year was 1307. King Edward I, known throughout Europe as one of England's greatest warrior kings, was once again leading an army toward Scotland. Despite his age and failing health, he refused to abandon the campaign. He believed it was his duty to finish what he had started decades earlier. But the long journey proved too much. On July 7, 1307, before reaching the battlefield, King Edward I died. His death marked the end of one of the most powerful reigns in English history. The news spread across the kingdom with incredible speed. Church bells rang, monasteries held special prayers. Nobles gathered to discuss what would happen next. For Joan, the news was deeply personal. The man who had once frightened all of Europe, the father who had punished her for marrying the man she loved, the king who had eventually forgiven her, was gone. She mourned not only a ruler, but a father. Like every family, theirs had experienced disagreements. There had been moments of anger, moments of disappointment, but there had also been forgiveness. In the end, Joan chose to remember the father who had accepted Ralph into the family, despite his initial fury. As England grieved, attention quickly turned to the new king,
Prince Edward was crowned as King Edward II. For years, people had wondered what kind of ruler he would become. Now there was no more waiting. The future had arrived. Edward II wasted little time making changes. Unlike his father, he preferred a more relaxed and personal style of leadership. He rewarded many of his close friends with titles and important positions. Some of these decisions pleased the court, others created immediate controversy. Powerful nobles who had supported Edward I became suspicious. They feared that the new king relied too heavily on a small circle of favorites. Joan watched these developments carefully. As the king's sister, she remained close to the royal family. She understood that every royal decision affected the stability of England. Fortunately, her relationship with Edward II was warm and trusting. The two siblings had always shared a strong bond. Unlike the tense relationship between father and son, Joan and her brother understood each other well. Edward respected Joan's intelligence. He knew she had successfully managed great estates and handled difficult political situations throughout her life. Although she never officially served as one of his advisors, her experience made her opinion valuable. Meanwhile, Ralph also benefited from the new king's generosity. Edward II confirmed many of the titles and lands Ralph held through his marriage to Joan. The family's future appeared secure. After years of uncertainty, Joan finally enjoyed a period of peace. Her children were growing into young nobles. Her marriage remained happy. Her brother now wore the English crown. For a brief moment, it seemed that life had rewarded Joan for all the hardships she had endured. But history rarely allows peace to last for long. Edward II's reign would soon face enormous political problems. Many powerful nobles refused to accept the influence of the king's closest companions. Arguments at court became more frequent. Old alliances began to weaken. England stood on the edge of another period of conflict. Joan had already witnessed how political disagreements could divide families. Now she feared they might divide an entire kingdom. She hoped her brother could avoid the mistakes that had destroyed so many rulers before him. Sadly, the challenges awaiting King Edward II would prove greater than anyone could have imagined. And Joan's story was approaching its final, unexpected chapter.
As King Edward II settled onto the English throne, Joan hoped the kingdom would enjoy a new era of peace. But ruling England proved far more difficult than wearing a crown. The young king inherited a powerful kingdom, yet he also inherited old rivalries, heavy debts, and restless nobles. Every decision he made was watched carefully. Every mistake was discussed throughout the kingdom. One of Edward's first actions was to reward the friends who had stood beside him during the difficult years of his father's reign. He trusted them completely. Among these companions was a nobleman named Piers Gaveston. The king admired him greatly. He gave Gaveston important titles, expensive gifts, and positions of influence at court. To Edward, this was simply an act of loyalty. To many nobles, however, it looked like favoritism. Some believed Gaveston had gained too much power too quickly. Others feared that experienced advisors were being ignored. Before long, disagreements filled the royal court.
Meetings that should have focused on governing England often turned into heated arguments. Powerful earls openly criticized the king's decisions. Some even refused to cooperate with the crown unless changes were made. Joan watched these events with growing concern. She had seen political conflicts before. She knew that pride could destroy friendships. She also knew that stubborn rulers often pushed loyal supporters away. Whenever possible, Joan encouraged calm discussion. She believed compromise was a sign of wisdom, not weakness. Although she remained loyal to her brother, she understood why some nobles were becoming frustrated. England needed unity. Without it, even the strongest kingdom could become unstable. At home, Joan continued focusing on her family. Her children were now old enough to begin their own education. She made sure they learned not only history and religion, but also kindness and responsibility. She often reminded them that true leadership began with respect for others. Ralph supported her completely. Their marriage remained one of mutual trust and affection. Unlike many noble couples of the time, they worked together as partners. They discussed estate matters together. They planned their children's future together. And whenever difficulties arose, they faced them side by side. People who visited their household noticed something unusual. Despite Joan's royal birth and Ralph's modest beginnings, there was no arrogance between them. Their marriage had survived imprisonment, political opposition, and public criticism. Those hardships had only strengthened their bond. Yet, while Joan found happiness at home, troubling news continued arriving from the royal court. The disagreements surrounding King Edward II were becoming more serious. Several powerful nobles began organizing against the king's closest advisors. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense. No one knew exactly what would happen next, but everyone sensed that England was moving toward another political crisis. Joan hoped her brother would find a peaceful solution before the conflict grew worse. Sadly, time was running out, not only for the kingdom, but for Joan herself. Within a few years, illness would unexpectedly bring an end to the life of one of England's most courageous princesses. Her remarkable journey was entering its final chapter.
The years that followed were filled with uncertainty. England was changing. The peaceful kingdom that Joan had hoped for was becoming increasingly divided. Arguments between King Edward II and the powerful nobles grew more frequent. Each side believed it was acting in the best interests of the country, but neither side was willing to step back. Joan watched these developments with a heavy heart. She had spent her entire life surrounded by political conflict. As a child, she had been used as a symbol of royal alliances. As a young woman, she had challenged her father's authority for the sake of love. Now, as a mature noblewoman, she understood that even the strongest kingdoms could be weakened by pride and distrust. Whenever members of the royal family gathered, conversations often turned toward politics. The mood was very different from the joyful banquets of earlier years. Instead of music and celebration, there were whispered discussions about loyalty, taxes, military campaigns, and growing tensions at court. Joan rarely spoke loudly during these meetings. She listened. She observed, and when asked for advice, she encouraged patience and understanding. She believed that lasting peace could never be built through anger alone. Meanwhile, life continued on her estates.
Harvests had to be collected, villages needed protection. Servants and tenants looked to Joan for leadership. She never forgot that the decisions made by nobles affected ordinary people the most. A poor harvest could leave families hungry. A new tax could force farmers into debt. A war fought far away could still change life in every village. Because of this, Joan worked hard to govern fairly. She visited her lands whenever possible. She listened to local officials. She settled disputes with care instead of rushing to judgment. Many people respected her not simply because she was a princess, but because she treated others with dignity. At home, her children were growing into young adults. Some were preparing for military service. Others were being introduced to noble responsibilities. Joan wanted them to understand something that titles alone could never teach. Honor, she often said, is measured by your actions, not your family name. These lessons reflected everything she had experienced throughout her remarkable life. She had learned that courage was not always found on the battlefield. Sometimes courage meant speaking the truth. Sometimes it meant protecting the people you loved, and sometimes it meant accepting the consequences of your own choices. Sadly, while Joan remained active and devoted to her family, her health began to decline. At first, the illness seemed minor. She became tired more easily. Long journeys exhausted her. Occasionally, she missed public ceremonies because she needed to rest. No one thought the condition was serious. Medieval physicians offered herbal medicines, warm baths, and prayers, but medical knowledge at the time was limited. Many diseases that are easily treated today were impossible to cure in the 14th century. As the months passed, Joan's strength slowly faded. Her family noticed the change. Ralph stayed close to her. Her children spent more time by her side. Even members of the royal court expressed concern. No one wanted to imagine losing the princess who had inspired so many with her courage and determination. Yet fate, once again, was preparing to write its own ending. The woman who had stood up to a king, defended the man she loved, and earned the respect of an entire kingdom, was approaching the final chapter of her extraordinary life. The death of Gilbert de Clare changed Joan's life overnight. One day, she had been the wife of one of England's most powerful noblemen. The next, she was a young widow with several small children and enormous responsibilities. In medieval society, widows were expected to mourn their husbands for a period of time. Joan did exactly that. She wore dark clothing. She attended religious services. She prayed for Gilbert's soul, as tradition required. But behind the quiet ceremonies, another reality was unfolding. Joan was now one of the wealthiest women in England. Through her late husband's estates and her royal blood, she possessed great influence. Powerful noblemen quickly realized that marrying Joan could bring immense wealth, land, and political connections. Before long, new marriage proposals began arriving. Some came from ambitious lords. Others were quietly discussed between noble families. Everyone assumed the final decision would belong to one person, King Edward I. As Joan's father and as the King of England, Edward believed he had the right to choose her next husband. This was completely normal in medieval Europe. Royal daughters rarely selected their own husbands. Their marriages served the interests of the kingdom, not personal happiness. Edward immediately began considering suitable candidates. He wanted another alliance that would strengthen England's political position, perhaps another powerful earl, perhaps even a foreign prince. Whatever the choice, It would certainly benefit the crown. But while the king searched for the perfect husband, Joan was keeping a dangerous secret. During the years after Gilbert's death, she had become close to a young knight named Ralph de Monthermer. Unlike the wealthy noble seeking her hand, Ralph came from a much more modest background. He was brave, honest, loyal. He served in Joan's household and earned respect through his character rather than his family name. The more time they spent together, the stronger their feelings became. For the first time in her life, Joan experienced something she had never been allowed to consider before: real love. There were no political negotiations, no royal treaties, no discussions about land or castles. Only two people who genuinely cared for one another. Joan knew the relationship was dangerous. Her father would never approve. A princess marrying an ordinary knight would be seen as an insult to the royal family. It could weaken political alliances. It could embarrass the king before the entire European nobility. Still, Joan refused to ignore her heart. She and Ralph continued meeting in secret. Every conversation carried enormous risk. If servants reported what they saw, if a noble overheard their plans, everything could be destroyed. Months passed. Their love only grew stronger. Eventually, they reached a decision that would change history. Rather than asking for the king's permission, they would marry in secret. It was an astonishing act of courage, or perhaps an act of desperation. They knew the consequences could be severe. Edward was famous for his strict discipline. He punished nobles who disobeyed him. He expected absolute loyalty from everyone, including his own children. Yet Joan believed that this time her own happiness mattered more than politics. The quiet ceremony took place away from the eyes of the royal court. No grand cathedral, no magnificent feast, no gathering of Europe's greatest nobles, only a small group of trusted witnesses. When the vows were spoken, Joan became Ralph's wife. For the first time in her life, she had made her own choice. It was the happiest day she had ever known. But happiness built on secrecy cannot remain hidden forever. Soon, King Edward would discover the truth, and when he did, his anger would shake the entire kingdom.
Joan of Acre's life had come to an end, but stories about remarkable people rarely end with their deaths. In many ways, Joan's influence became even stronger after she was gone. Her children carried forward the legacy of both the Plantagenet royal family and the powerful de Clare bloodline. Some would become important nobles. Others would marry into influential families across England. Through them, Joan's story continued into future generations. Ralph de Monthermer faced a life he had never imagined. For years, Joan had been his greatest companion, his strongest supporter, and the reason his life had changed forever. Without her, the castles felt quieter, the great halls seemed empty, the laughter that had once filled their home was gone. Although he continued serving the English crown, those close to Ralph noticed that he was no longer the cheerful young knight who had once risked everything for love. He had lost the woman who believed in him when almost no one else did. Meanwhile, King Edward II also struggled with the loss of his sister. The political problems surrounding his reign continued to grow. Powerful nobles challenged his authority. Arguments became more intense. England slowly drifted toward instability. In difficult moments, Edward no longer had Joan's calm voice, encouraging patience and understanding.
Historians cannot say exactly how different events might have been had Joan lived longer, but many believe she possessed a rare ability to bring people together. She understood both royal authority and personal loyalty. She knew how to speak firmly without creating unnecessary enemies. Those qualities were becoming increasingly rare. As the years passed, people began remembering Joan for something unusual. Most medieval princesses were remembered because of political marriages arranged by their fathers. Some were remembered only as the mothers of future kings. Others disappeared almost completely from history. Joan was different. She became remembered for making her own choice. She dared to follow her heart at a time when doing so could have destroyed her future. Her courage challenged expectations about what royal women could do. Modern historians often point to Joan's secret marriage as one of the most extraordinary personal decisions made by an English princess during the Middle Ages. She reminded the world that even inside royal palaces, people experienced the same emotions as everyone else: love, fear, hope, loss, and the desire to decide their own future. Over the centuries, chroniclers continued recording her story. Some admired her bravery. Others criticized her decision to disobey her father. But almost everyone agreed on one point: Joan of Acre was unforgettable. She had lived during an age when kings ruled with absolute authority. Yet she proved that quiet determination could sometimes be stronger than royal commands. Her story also changed the way many later generations viewed medieval princesses. They were not simply decorations at court. They were educated, they managed estates, they influenced politics, and sometimes they changed history through personal courage rather than military victories. Today, more than 700 years later, Joan's name still appears in history books, not because she conquered kingdoms, not because she led armies, but because she had the courage to live according to her convictions, even when the cost seemed impossibly high. That alone made her one of the most remarkable women of medieval England. But Joan's story also teaches us something that remains true today. Power may shape history, yet character is what people remember.
Although Joan of Acre's life had ended, the world she left behind continued to change. England was entering one of the most turbulent periods in its history. King Edward II struggled to maintain control over his kingdom. The confidence that had surrounded his father's reign was beginning to disappear. Many of the kingdom's most powerful nobles questioned the king's decisions. Some believed he relied too heavily on a small group of trusted companions. Others felt their own influence was being ignored. Disagreements that had once been private slowly became public. The unity that Joan had always hoped for seemed to fade with each passing year. Looking back, historians often wonder how Joan might have influenced these events if she had lived longer. She had earned the respect of both the royal family and many noble households. She understood how to balance loyalty with honesty. More importantly, she knew how to disagree without creating lasting enemies. That rare ability was desperately needed during Edward II's troubled reign. But history offers no second chances. Joan's voice had fallen silent. England would now face its future without one of its wisest royal women.
Meanwhile, Ralph de Monthermer continued serving the crown. Although he had lost the woman he loved, he remained loyal to the kingdom. He fulfilled his military duties and managed his responsibilities with dignity. Many who had once doubted him now respected him deeply. They remembered how he had risen not because of ambition, but because of his loyalty, courage, and devotion to Joan. Her children also grew into adulthood. Each carried a part of Joan's legacy. Some inherited lands, others married into influential noble families. Through them, Joan's bloodline spread across England. In time, many later kings and queens could trace their ancestry back to her. Her influence reached much farther than anyone could have imagined during her lifetime. But perhaps Joan's greatest legacy was not political at all. It was personal. She reminded future generations that even those born into royal families remained human. They experienced joy. They experienced heartbreak. They made mistakes. And sometimes they found the courage to follow their hearts despite overwhelming pressure. For centuries, many people imagined medieval princesses as silent figures who simply obeyed every command. Joan's life tells a different story. She was intelligent, independent, thoughtful, and remarkably brave. She respected tradition, but she also understood that some traditions deserved to be questioned. When faced with the greatest decision of her life, she accepted the consequences of choosing love over political advantage. She never blamed others for her choice. She stood by it until the very end. That quiet determination became the reason historians continue telling her story more than 700 years later. Today, when visitors walk through the ruins of ancient castles or read about England's medieval kings and queens, Joan's name still appears among them. Not because she ruled a kingdom, not because she commanded armies, but because she proved that true courage sometimes appears in the quietest moments. A single decision, a single promise, a single act of honesty. Those choices can echo through history just as loudly as the greatest victories on the battlefield. And that is why the story of Joan of Acre continues to inspire people even today. Her life reminds us that titles may be inherited, but character is always earned.
By the early 13th century, England had entered a period of uncertainty. King Edward I was now firmly on the throne, but ruling a kingdom proved far more difficult than inheriting one. Many of the problems his father had kept under control were beginning to resurface. Powerful noble families demanded greater influence. Military campaigns drained the royal treasury, and trust between the king and his barons slowly began to disappear. Without Joan's calming presence, the royal family felt different. She had often served as a bridge between strong personalities. She understood both the responsibilities of the crown and the concerns of the nobility. Although she had never officially held political office, her wisdom had quietly influenced those around her. Now that voice was gone. Meanwhile, Ralph de Monthermer continued his duties with dignity. He rarely sought attention. Instead, he focused on raising Joan's children and honoring the promises they had made to each other. Those who knew him often spoke about his loyalty. Years earlier, many had believed he married Joan for wealth and status. Time proved them wrong.
If power had been his goal, he would have abandoned her when King Edward imprisoned him. Instead, he accepted prison rather than deny his marriage. Even after Joan's death, he remained devoted to her memory. That loyalty earned him respect throughout England. Joan's children also carried their mother's values into adulthood. They had grown up listening to stories about courage, honesty, and compassion. Unlike many noble families where children were raised mainly for political advantage, Joan had encouraged her sons and daughters to value integrity above ambition. Some became respected nobles. Others strengthened important alliances through marriage. Together, they ensured that Joan's influence continued long after her lifetime. Historians studying Joan's life often point out something remarkable. She lived during an age when royal women possessed very limited freedom. Their futures were usually arranged before they reached adulthood. Their marriages served political purposes. Their personal wishes were rarely considered important. Yet Joan changed her own destiny. She accepted her first arranged marriage because duty required it. But after becoming a widow, she chose a different path. That decision transformed her into one of the most unusual princesses of medieval England. Her story also reveals another important truth. Courage does not always require swords or armies. Sometimes the bravest act is simply refusing to betray your own conscience. Joan understood the risks. She knew her father could imprison Ralph. She knew she might lose her lands, her titles, and even her place within the royal family. Still, she accepted those consequences because love was worth defending. Centuries later, that decision continues to inspire readers around the world. Modern society often celebrates famous kings, victorious generals, and legendary warriors. But Joan reminds us that history is also shaped by quieter acts of bravery. A private promise, a difficult conversation, a refusal to surrender deeply held values. Those moments rarely appear on battlefields, yet they often leave the greatest mark on history. As England continued moving through an uncertain future, Joan's story quietly became part of the kingdom's larger legacy. Her name lived on, not because she wore a crown, but because she remained true to herself when it mattered most. And perhaps that is the greatest victory anyone can ever achieve.
As the years passed, the story of Joan of Acres spread far beyond the walls of England's royal castles. Monks copied chronicles by hand. Traveling storytellers shared tales in great halls. Noble families spoke of the princess who had dared to follow her own heart. Each generation remembered her a little differently. Some admired her as a devoted wife. Others praised her as a courageous daughter. Many simply remembered her as a woman who refused to let fear control her life. Her story became more than a family history. It became a lesson. Young noblewomen heard about Joan and realized that strength was not measured only by royal titles. Young noblemen learned that true honor came from keeping promises, even when the cost was high. Ralph de Monthermer became an important part of that lesson as well. History often celebrates kings and generals. Yet Ralph showed another kind of greatness. He never tried to become famous. He never sought power for himself.
His greatest achievement was remaining loyal to the woman he loved. Even after Joan's death, he protected her children and continued serving the English crown with dignity. Their marriage, once considered a scandal, slowly became respected by many historians. It proved that genuine affection could exist even inside a world dominated by politics. Looking back, Joan's first marriage and second marriage tell two very different stories. Her first marriage to Gilbert de Clare represented duty. It strengthened the kingdom. It fulfilled her father's plans. It reflected the traditions of medieval Europe. Her second marriage represented choice. It reflected her own heart. It challenged tradition. And it demonstrated that personal happiness sometimes required extraordinary courage. Neither chapter of her life erased the other. Instead, together they showed the difficult balance between responsibility and freedom. That balance still exists today. People continue facing choices between what others expect and what they truly believe. Joan's life reminds us that such decisions are rarely easy. There is often a price for following your convictions, but there can also be great reward. Historians continue studying Joan because she does not fit the usual image of a medieval princess. She was neither a helpless victim nor a rebellious revolutionary. She respected her family. She honored her responsibilities. Yet when the most important decision of her life arrived, she accepted responsibility for making it herself. That quiet confidence made her extraordinary. Even now, more than 7 centuries later, visitors walking through England's ancient castles sometimes pause when they hear Joan's name. They imagine the young princess crossing the sea to France. They imagine the frightened widow secretly marrying the man she loved. They imagine the brave daughter standing before one of Europe's most powerful kings and calmly defending her choice. Those moments continue to capture the imagination because they feel deeply human. Behind every crown, there is a person. Behind every title, there is a life filled with hope, fear, joy, and sorrow. Joan of Acre never ruled England. She never commanded armies. She never wore the English crown. Yet she accomplished something that few rulers ever achieve. She left behind a story that people still remember hundreds of years later. And sometimes, being remembered with respect is a greater victory than wearing any crown.
History often remembers kings for the wars they fought. It remembers generals for the battles they won. It remembers castles for the strength of their walls. But sometimes, the most powerful stories belong to people who never led an army at all. Joan of Acre was one of those people. She lived in an age when almost every important decision was made by men. Kings ruled kingdoms, earls controlled vast estates, bishops advised the crown. Women, especially princesses, were expected to obey. Yet Joan quietly proved that influence could take many forms. She never challenged the throne with violence. She never raised an army against her father. She never tried to seize power. Instead, she changed history through courage, honesty, and determination. That is why historians still study her life today. When researchers examine medieval England, Joan's story offers something rare. It shows that royal women were far more active than many people imagine. They negotiated, they managed estates, they educated their children, they advised powerful rulers, and sometimes, like Joan, they made decisions that changed the course of their own lives. Her courage also changed the way later generations viewed royal marriage. For centuries, arranged marriages had been accepted without question. Joan reminded people that even those born into royal families possessed personal hopes and dreams. Although her choice did not end arranged marriages, it became one of history's earliest examples of a princess placing love above political ambition. That decision echoed through the centuries. Today, historians often compare Joan with other remarkable royal women who challenged expectations in different ways. Each lived in a different era. Each faced different struggles, but Joan's story remains unique because she succeeded. She defended her marriage, she earned her father's forgiveness, and she spent the rest of her life beside the man she truly loved. Not every medieval love story ended so happily. Many ended in tragedy, many ended in exile, some ended in execution. Joan's story reminds us that history is never predictable. Sometimes even the most powerful king in Europe can change his mind. Sometimes love can survive impossible odds, and sometimes courage is rewarded. As visitors explore medieval castles today, they often admire towering walls, ancient gates, and magnificent halls. Yet the greatest stories rarely belong to the stones themselves. They belong to the people who once walked those corridors, people who laughed, who cried, who dreamed, who feared, who hoped. Joan once walked through those same halls. She attended royal feasts, she listened to political debates, she celebrated weddings, she mourned funerals. She lived a life filled with both privilege and pain, and through it all, she remained true to herself. That quiet strength became her greatest achievement. Long after castles began to crumble, long after kingdoms changed, the story of Joan of Acre continued to live on. Because history may preserve buildings, but it is character that preserves a name.
As the centuries passed, the world changed in ways Joan of Acre could never have imagined. The castles where she once lived slowly aged. Some became royal residences, others fell into ruin. Stone walls that had witnessed grand celebrations and painful family arguments stood silently as generations came and went. Kings rose to power, kings lost their thrones, entire dynasties disappeared, yet Joan's story refused to fade away. Why? Because her life speaks to something timeless. Every generation understands what it means to face impossible choices. Should you follow duty or follow your heart? Should you obey expectations or remain true to yourself? Joan faced those questions more than 700 years ago. The answers she chose continue to inspire people today. Modern historians often describe medieval England as a harsh and dangerous world. Disease spread quickly, wars lasted for years, life expectancy was short. Even members of the royal family lived with constant uncertainty. Joan experienced all of it. She lost her mother while still young. She entered an arranged marriage for political reasons. She became a widow at an early age. She risked everything by secretly marrying the man she truly loved. She stood before one of Europe's most powerful kings and defended her decision without fear. Very few people in history experience so many life-changing moments. Yet through every challenge, Joan remained remarkably consistent. She valued loyalty. She valued honesty. She valued love. Those values guided every major decision she made. That consistency is one reason historians admire her today. She never pretended to be someone she wasn't. She accepted responsibility for every choice she made, even when those choices brought hardship.
her story also reminds us that courage is often quiet. It doesn't always appear on battlefields. It isn't always celebrated with statues or monuments. Sometimes courage is found in a private conversation, a difficult decision, a promise kept despite overwhelming pressure. Joan's greatest victory was not defeating an enemy. It was refusing to betray her own beliefs. Meanwhile, the England she left behind continued changing rapidly. Her brother, King Edward II, faced growing opposition from powerful nobles. Political conflicts intensified. The unity her father had worked so hard to build slowly began to weaken. Looking back, many historians wonder whether Joan's wisdom and calm influence might have helped ease some of those tensions had she lived longer. Of course, history cannot answer questions like that. It only records what truly happened. And what truly happened was extraordinary enough. A princess challenged tradition. A king eventually forgave her. A marriage built on love survived against every expectation. That alone makes Joan's story one of the most remarkable personal journeys in medieval English history. Even today, students, historians, and visitors to ancient castles continue discovering her remarkable life. Not because she wore the finest jewels, not because she lived in magnificent palaces, but because she proved that character can outshine even the greatest crown. And perhaps that is the legacy every person hopes to leave behind.
As we reach this point in Joan of Acre's remarkable story, it is worth stepping back for a moment. What kind of woman was she, really? History gives us dates. It records marriages. It lists titles and family connections. But those facts alone cannot describe a person's true character. To understand Joan, we must look beyond the royal records. She was born into extraordinary privilege. From the moment she entered the world, servants attended to her every need. She lived in magnificent castles. She wore beautiful clothing. She received an education that few people of her time could even imagine. Yet, privilege never guaranteed happiness. As a child, Joan spent years away from her parents. She watched members of her family die at young ages. She learned that even kings and queens could not escape illness or grief. Those early experiences shaped her character. Instead of becoming proud, she became compassionate. Instead of becoming fearful, she became determined. Her greatest strength was not her royal blood. It was her ability to remain calm when life became difficult. Think about the moment when King Edward I discovered her secret marriage. Many people would have panicked. Others might have lied. Some would have blamed someone else. Joan did none of those things. She admitted the truth. She accepted responsibility, and she defended her decision with dignity. That required enormous courage, especially when speaking to one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. She understood that honesty carried consequences, but she also believed that a life built on lies could never bring real happiness. That belief guided every important choice she made. Joan also possessed remarkable patience. She did not rebel against her father. She did not encourage others to challenge the king. She waited. She trusted the truth would eventually be understood. Her patience proved stronger than anger. Over time, even King Edward himself recognized the sincerity of her love. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson from Joan's life.
Real strength is not always loud. It does not always demand attention. Sometimes strength is simply refusing to abandon what you know is right. Joan's quiet confidence changed not only her own future, but also the lives of those around her. Ralph gained respect because Joan believed in him. Their children grew up in a home built on love instead of political ambition. Even the king himself learned that authority could exist alongside compassion. Very few people influence others in so many different ways. As historians continue studying medieval England, Joan remains one of the clearest examples of personal integrity within the royal family. She was not perfect. No historical figure ever is. She made difficult choices. Some people disagreed with those choices. Others praised them. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. Joan never pretended to be someone she wasn't. She remained true to her beliefs from beginning to end. And that quiet honesty became the foundation of her lasting legacy. Because in the end, people may forget the clothes you wore. They may forget the castles you lived in. They may even forget the titles you carried. But they rarely forget the character you showed when life became difficult.
If you had met Joan of Acre during her lifetime, you might not have realized that history would one day remember her. She did not lead armies into battle. She did not sit upon England's throne. She did not issue famous royal decrees. From the outside, her life may have seemed similar to that of many other medieval princesses, but appearances can be deceiving. History is often shaped by people who quietly change the lives of those around them. Joan was one of those people. She taught her children that kindness was not a weakness. She showed her husband that loyalty could overcome fear. She reminded her father that even kings could learn from compassion. These were not dramatic victories celebrated with trumpets and banners. They were quiet victories. Yet they lasted much longer. As centuries passed, historians searching through medieval records discovered something unusual. Whenever Joan's name appeared, it was often connected with words like courage, loyalty, determination, and love. Very few princesses of her time earned that kind of reputation. Many royal women were remembered only because they gave birth to future kings. Others were mentioned only in marriage agreements or family trees. Joan's story felt different. She was remembered as a person, not simply as a title. That distinction matters because history is full of famous names that reveal very little about the people themselves. With Joan, we can see her personality shining through the centuries. We see the curious little girl learning in France. We see the young bride accepting a political marriage she never chose. We see the grieving widow facing an uncertain future. We see the determined woman secretly marrying the man she loved. And finally, we see the confident princess standing before her father, refusing to deny the truth. Each chapter reveals another part of her character. None of those moments happened by accident. They were the result of years of learning, growing, and making difficult choices. Joan's life also reminds us that love is never guaranteed. It requires trust. It requires sacrifice. It requires courage. Both Joan and Ralph understood that from the beginning. They knew their marriage might cost them everything, yet neither one walked away. That kind of devotion is rare in any century. Perhaps that is why their story continues to move readers today. Modern life is very different from medieval England. We no longer live inside stone castles. We no longer arrange royal marriages to secure political alliances. Yet the emotions remain exactly the same. People still struggle between duty and happiness. They still face difficult family decisions. They still wonder whether following their heart is worth the risk. Joan's story offers no easy answers. Instead, it offers an example. She accepted responsibility for every choice she made. She faced the consequences with dignity, and she never abandoned the people she loved. That is a legacy far more valuable than wealth or power. Because castles may crumble, crowns may change hands, kingdoms may disappear, but stories of courage, stories of loyalty, and stories of love can survive forever.
Imagine standing inside a great medieval castle at sunset. The long stone corridors are quiet. The banners hanging from the walls barely move in the cool evening air. The sounds of horses in the courtyard slowly fade as darkness settles over the kingdom. Centuries ago, Joan of Acre walked through halls just like these. She spoke with kings. She greeted queens. She laughed with her children. She worried about the future. She dreamed of a life she could truly call her own. Today, the voices are gone. The people have disappeared, but the places remain. Visitors who explore medieval castles often admire the massive towers, the deep moats, and the towering gates. Yet every stone holds memories. Some witnessed royal weddings. Others witnessed political arguments. Some heard joyful celebrations. Others echoed with heartbreaking news. Joan experienced all of these moments during her lifetime. She knew both the beauty and the burden of royal life. Many people imagined that princesses lived perfect lives, filled with luxury. The truth was far more complicated. Yes, Joan enjoyed privileges that ordinary people could never imagine. She wore beautiful gowns. She dined in magnificent halls. She traveled with servants and royal guards. But every privilege came with a price. Her childhood was planned by others. Her education served political goals. Her first marriage was arranged long before she could decide for herself. Freedom was something she had to fight for. And when that opportunity finally arrived, she risked everything to protect it. That choice defined her legacy, not because it was easy, but because it was difficult. Anyone can follow the safest path. It takes courage to choose the uncertain one. Joan understood that better than most. Even after centuries, historians continue returning to her story because it feels surprisingly modern. The questions she faced still exist today. How much should we sacrifice for our families? When should we follow tradition? When should we challenge it? How do we balance responsibility with personal happiness? There are no simple answers. Joan did not claim to have all the answers either. She simply lived according to her conscience. Sometimes she succeeded. Sometimes she suffered. But she never abandoned the values that mattered most to her. That honesty gives her story its lasting power. History often celebrates extraordinary achievements, great victories, famous speeches, legendary battles. Joan's greatest achievement was quieter than all of those. She remained true to herself. She showed kindness even during conflict. She defended the people she loved without hatred toward those who opposed her. That is a rare quality in any age. Perhaps that is why her story continues to inspire readers across the world, not because she was perfect, but because she was deeply human. She laughed, she cried, she doubted, she hoped, she loved, and in doing so, she reminded future generations that behind every royal title is a real person facing the same emotions that unite all humanity. That simple truth has survived longer than kingdoms themselves, and it will likely continue inspiring people for centuries to come.
As Joan of Acre's story reached its final pages, one truth became impossible to ignore. History had remembered her, not because she conquered kingdoms, not because she commanded great armies, but because she had the courage to make one deeply personal decision and stand by it for the rest of her life. More than 700 years have passed since Joan walked through the halls of England's royal castles. The world around us has changed beyond recognition. The medieval kingdoms have disappeared. The castles that once symbolized absolute power have become historic landmarks. The kings and queens who ruled Europe now exist only in books and memories. Yet, Joan's story continues to speak to us. Why? Because human nature has never truly changed. People still struggle between duty and desire. Parents still hope to guide their children. Children still dream of choosing their own paths. Families still experience love, disagreement, forgiveness, and reconciliation. Joan lived those experiences centuries before the modern world existed. That is what makes her story timeless. Historians often describe the Middle Ages as an era of rigid rules and limited freedom. In many ways, that description is accurate. Society expected everyone to know their place, especially those born into royal families. Princesses were expected to obey. Kings were expected to command. Nobles were expected to protect their privileges. Breaking those expectations carried enormous risks. Joan understood every one of those risks. She knew exactly what could happen if her father discovered her secret marriage. She could lose her wealth. She could lose her titles. She could lose her family's trust forever. And yet, she chose honesty over fear. That single choice transformed her from an ordinary medieval princess into one of history's most memorable royal women. Her courage did not come from physical strength, it came from conviction. She believed some things were worth protecting, regardless of the consequences. Love was one of those things. Honor was another. Those beliefs shaped every important chapter of her life. They shaped the way she treated her husband, the way she raised her children, the way she spoke to her father, and the way future generations would remember her. Even today, visitors exploring medieval England often pause when they learn about Joan of Acre. Many arrive expecting stories of battles and conquests. Instead, they discover a story about family, about forgiveness, about loyalty, about choosing hope when fear would have been easier. Perhaps that is why Joan's life still feels so modern. The setting belongs to another century, but the emotions belong to all of us. Every generation faces difficult choices. Every generation searches for courage. Every generation hopes to leave behind a meaningful legacy. Joan did exactly that. She proved that history is not written only by rulers and warriors. Sometimes it is written by ordinary human choices made with extraordinary courage. And those stories are the ones that live forever.
Now that we have followed Joan of Acre's journey from birth to legacy,
Let us step back and look at the larger world she lived in. The Middle Ages were not simply a time of castles and knights. They were a time of uncertainty. Every sunrise brought new challenges. A poor harvest could mean famine. A disease could spread through an entire village in weeks. A single political decision could start a war that lasted for years. For ordinary people, survival was never guaranteed. Even members of the royal family lived with constant danger. Joan understood this reality from childhood. She watched brothers and sisters die at young ages. She lost her mother while still a teenager. She saw powerful nobles fall from favor almost overnight. She watched kingdoms change through war, marriage, and political alliances. Those experiences taught her something many people never learn. Life is unpredictable. The only thing we truly control is how we respond to it. Joan chose courage, again and again. When duty demanded sacrifice, she accepted it. When love demanded bravery, she accepted that too. She never expected life to be easy. She simply refused to let fear make her decisions. That attitude made her extraordinary. Think about the choices she faced. As a child, she obeyed her family's wishes. As a young bride, she fulfilled her responsibilities with dignity. As a widow, she stood at a crossroads. She could have accepted another arranged marriage and lived comfortably. No one would have questioned her decision. Instead, she chose the harder path. She chose the man she loved. That one decision changed everything. It tested her relationship with her father. It placed Ralph's life in danger. It threatened her wealth and position. Yet, in the end, it also brought her genuine happiness. History rarely gives us perfect endings. Joan's life was no exception. She still experienced illness. She still faced loss. She still died far younger than anyone would have wished. But she lived according to her own values. And perhaps that matters more than the number of years we are given. Modern historians often describe Joan as one of the most independent royal women of medieval England, not because she rejected tradition completely, but because she knew when tradition should be respected and when should be challenged. That balance required wisdom. Anyone can rebel. Anyone can obey. Knowing when to do either is far more difficult. Joan found that balance. Her example continues to inspire scholars studying medieval history today, not because she was flawless, but because she remained honest through every stage of her life. That honesty transformed an ordinary princess into an unforgettable historical figure. And more than 7 centuries later, her voice still echoes through history, not in the form of speeches or royal commands, but in the choices she made when no one else could decide for her. Sometimes that is the most powerful legacy a person can leave behind.
As Joan of Acre's story continues to echo through history, it also opens a window into the lives of countless medieval women whose names have been forgotten. For every princess remembered in the history books, there were thousands of noblewomen who faced similar struggles. They lived in a world where their futures were often decided by others. Marriage was rarely a personal choice. Education was designed to prepare them for duty rather than independence. Their greatest responsibility was to strengthen their family's position through loyalty and service. Yet many of these women quietly influenced history in ways that official records barely mention. They managed estates while their husbands fought in distant wars. They negotiated with neighboring lords during times of crisis. They protected villages from famine by carefully storing food supplies. They raised future kings, queens, knights, and leaders. Without them, medieval society could not have functioned. Joan was fortunate because history preserved her name, but her courage represented something much larger. She became a symbol of every woman who tried to balance personal happiness with family responsibility. That balance has never been easy. Even today, people continue facing similar questions. How much should we sacrifice for others? How much should we sacrifice for ourselves? Where do we draw the line between duty and personal freedom? Joan never claimed to know every answer. Instead, she showed that difficult choices require both wisdom and courage. One reason historians admire Joan is because she never acted carelessly. She thought carefully before making important decisions. She understood the risks. She accepted the consequences. That sense of responsibility separated her from many legendary figures whose stories depend on reckless bravery. Joan's courage was thoughtful, patient, steady. It was the kind of courage that grows slowly through experience. Her relationship with King Edward I also deserves special attention. Many people remember only their conflict, but their story is actually one of change. At first, Edward saw only disobedience. He believed Joan had damaged the dignity of the royal family. Over time, however, he recognized something deeper. He saw his daughter's honesty. He saw Ralph's loyalty. He realized that true respect cannot be forced through fear alone. The king's willingness to forgive became one of the most meaningful moments in their family's history. It reminds us that even powerful rulers are capable of growth. Even kings can change their minds. That lesson remains just as valuable today as it was 700 years ago. Leadership is not measured only by strength. It is also measured by humility, by the ability to admit when compassion is wiser than punishment. Joan's life brought out those qualities in her father. Perhaps that was one of her greatest achievements. She did not simply change her own future. She changed the perspective of one of Europe's most powerful monarchs. That is an extraordinary accomplishment for anyone, especially for a princess living in the Middle Ages. As the years passed and new generations inherited England's castles, Joan's story quietly became part of the nation's history, not as a tale of war, not as a tale of conquest, but as a reminder that the strongest hearts are often found far away from the battlefield.
As time moved forward, England continued to change. New kings came to the throne. New castles were built. Old alliances faded and fresh rivalries emerged. Yet the story of Joan of Acre remained quietly alive. It survived in handwritten chronicles, family records, and the memories passed from one generation to the next. Unlike many medieval princesses whose names gradually disappeared, Joan's story endured because it carried a timeless message. Historians who study the Plantagenet dynasty often pause when they reach Joan's life. Compared with many members of her famous family, she fought no battles and claimed no throne. Even so, she influenced the people around her in remarkable ways. Her courage inspired loyalty. Her honesty earned forgiveness. Her compassion strengthened her family. These achievements cannot be measured with castles or crowns. They are measured through the lives she touched. One of the greatest examples of this influence can be seen in her children. Growing up, they witnessed a marriage built on genuine affection rather than political necessity. They saw two parents who respected each other. They learned that leadership meant serving others instead of simply commanding them. Those lessons shaped the next generation. In this way, Joan's values continued long after her own lifetime. Her story also reminds us that history is not always written by the loudest voices. Some people leave their mark through speeches, others through victories in war. Joan left hers through quiet determination. She showed that kindness could exist alongside strength, that loyalty could exist alongside independence, that love could exist alongside responsibility. These ideas may sound simple, but during the Middle Ages they were far from ordinary. Royal families were expected to place politics above personal feelings. Joan understood that expectation better than anyone. She accepted it during her first marriage. She fulfilled every duty placed upon her. Only after becoming a widow did she allow herself to choose a different path. That decision required extraordinary bravery. She knew the risks before she acted. She understood her father's authority. She understood the traditions of her time. Yet she also understood something equally important. A life without honesty would never bring lasting peace. That belief became the foundation of every decision she made. Modern readers sometimes wonder whether Joan considered herself a heroine. The answer is probably no. She likely saw herself simply as a daughter, a wife, and a mother trying to do what she believed was right. Perhaps that is exactly why her story feels so authentic. She never sought fame. She never expected future generations to remember her. She simply lived according to her conscience. Ironically, that very humility became one of the reasons history refused to forget her. Centuries later, scholars continue reading the same medieval documents that first recorded her remarkable life. Each generation discovers something new. Some admire her courage. Some admire her patience. Others admire the forgiveness that eventually reunited her with her father. But nearly everyone agrees on one thing. Joan of Acre proved that true greatness is not always found in power. Sometimes it is found in quiet acts of courage that change lives forever.
As our journey through Joan of Acre's life nears a conclusion, one final question remains. What can we learn from her story today? After all, the world Joan knew has vanished. The castles have become museums. The armor has been placed behind glass. The medieval kingdoms have long since disappeared. Yet the challenges people face have not changed as much as we might think. Every generation must choose between fear and courage, between comfort and conviction, between following expectations and following the path they truly believe is right. Joan faced those same choices over 700 years ago. She did not always choose the easiest path, but she consistently chose the path she believed was honest. That is why her story still resonates today. Consider her relationship with her father. King Edward I was one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. Few people dared to disagree with him. Yet Joan showed that respect and disagreement can exist together. She never insulted her father. She never tried to embarrass him publicly. Instead, she spoke with honesty and dignity. She defended her decision while continuing to respect his position as both her father and her king. That balance is rare. It reminds us that standing up for our beliefs does not require hatred or anger. Sometimes the strongest argument is spoken calmly.
Joan also teaches us the importance of accepting responsibility. She never blamed Ralph for their secret marriage. She never claimed she had been forced into the decision. She openly admitted that it was her choice. She accepted every consequence that followed. In today's world, where people often search for someone else to blame, Joan's example feels surprisingly modern. Real courage means accepting responsibility for the decisions we make. Her story also reminds us that forgiveness is one of the greatest forms of strength. King Edward eventually forgave his daughter. Joan forgave her father's anger. Together, they rebuilt a relationship that many believed had been destroyed forever. Without forgiveness, their family would have remained divided. Instead, they found peace. That lesson has never gone out of date. Families still experience disagreements. Friends still make mistakes. Communities still face conflict. Forgiveness remains one of the few things powerful enough to heal those wounds. Perhaps that is the greatest reason Joan's story continues to inspire people. It is not simply a medieval love story. It is a story about trust, about patience, about family, about hope, and above all, about remaining true to yourself even when the world expects something different. Those values belong to every century, not just the Middle Ages. As historians continue uncovering the lives of remarkable women from the past, Joan of Acre will always hold a special place among them. She proved that history is shaped not only by the people who rule kingdoms, but also by the people who have the courage to live according to their principles. And sometimes that kind of courage changes the world more than any battle ever could.
As historians continue to study the Middle Ages, one fact becomes increasingly clear. History is not shaped only by kings and queens. It is also shaped by ordinary human decisions. A promise, a sacrifice, an act of forgiveness, a choice made in a quiet moment. Joan of Acre's life reminds us of that truth. She never expected to become famous. She simply wanted to live honestly. When faced with impossible choices, she followed her conscience. That decision transformed her from a little-known medieval princess into one of England's most admired royal women. If we compare Joan with many other historical figures, an interesting pattern appears. Some rulers gained enormous power, but were quickly forgotten. Others won great battles only to have their achievements fade with time. Joan achieved something different. She earned respect. Respect cannot be inherited. It cannot be conquered. It cannot be forced. It must be earned through character. That is exactly what Joan accomplished. Her story also changes the way we think about the Middle Ages. Many people imagine medieval women as silent figures with little influence over their own lives. Joan proves that reality was far more complex. Although society placed many limits upon her, she still found ways to shape her own future. She used wisdom instead of violence, patience instead of anger, truth instead of deception. Those choices became her greatest victories. Another remarkable part of Joan's story is the relationship she built with Ralph de Monthermer. Their marriage reminds us that lasting love depends on far more than wealth or social status.
Ralph entered the royal family with neither great titles nor enormous estates. What he offered Joan was something much rarer: loyalty, respect, and unwavering devotion. Those qualities carried them through imprisonment, public criticism, and years of uncertainty. Together, they proved that genuine partnership is built on trust rather than power. Even after Joan's death, that example continued inspiring future generations. It showed that the strongest relationships are created not through political agreements, but through mutual respect. Perhaps that is why modern readers still connect with their story. The clothes have changed, the castles have changed, the laws have changed, but love, loyalty, and courage remain exactly the same. As we look back across more than 700 years of history, Joan's life reminds us of something deeply important. Every person leaves behind two legacies. The first is what they achieve. The second is how they treat other people. Castles eventually crumble. Kingdoms eventually disappear. Even the greatest monuments are worn away by time. But kindness, integrity, and courage can live forever in the stories people continue to tell. Joan of Acre left behind no great empire. She left behind something even more enduring, a reminder that true greatness begins with the choices we make every single day. And that is why centuries after her death, her story still deserves to be told.
Every great story eventually reaches its final page, not because the memories disappear, but because the lessons have been passed on. Joan of Acre's journey began in a distant land, far from the kingdom she would one day call home. She was born into one of the most powerful royal families in Europe. From childhood, her future seemed already written. Others decided where she would live. Others decided whom she would marry. Others planned the path her life should follow. For a time, Joan accepted those expectations. She fulfilled her duties. She honored her family. She served her kingdom with dignity. But when destiny offered her a second chance after the death of her first husband, she made the most important decision of her life. She chose love. That single decision changed everything. It brought conflict. It brought heartache. It brought uncertainty. Yet it also brought happiness that no political alliance could ever provide. Joan paid a high price for following her heart. She watched her husband imprisoned. She lost her lands. She faced the anger of one of the most powerful kings in Europe. Still, she never denied the truth. She never abandoned the man she loved. And in the end, her honesty achieved what force never could. It changed her father's heart. That victory was not won on a battlefield. It was won through patience, through courage, through unwavering faith in what she believed was right. Perhaps that is why Joan's story still speaks to us after more than 7 centuries. Every one of us faces moments when the easy path and the right path are not the same. Those moments define who we become. Joan reminds us that real courage is not the absence of fear. It is choosing to do what you believe is right despite that fear. Her life also teaches us something about forgiveness. King Edward I could have spent the rest of his life punishing his daughter. Instead, he chose reconciliation. Joan could have answered anger with bitterness. Instead, she answered it with respect.
Because of those choices, a broken family became whole again. That lesson remains just as meaningful today as it was in medieval England. As we close this remarkable journey, Joan of Acre should be remembered not simply as an English princess, not simply as the daughter of King Edward I, and not simply as the wife of Ralph de Monthermer. She should be remembered as a woman who proved that kindness can be stronger than power, that honesty can overcome fear, and that love, when guided by integrity, can leave a legacy that outlives kingdoms. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life of one of medieval England's most extraordinary women. If you enjoyed this story and would like to explore more fascinating tales from history, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who love discovering the remarkable people hidden within the pages of history. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and remember, history is not only the story of kings and queens, it is the story of ordinary human choices that become extraordinary through courage. Thank you for watching.
Before we end this journey completely, there is one final chapter worth exploring. What happened to the people Joan left behind? History continued after her death, and the lives of those closest to her took very different paths. Her husband, Ralph de Monthermer, continued serving the English crown for many years. Although he later married, historians believe Joan remained the defining love of his life. After all, it was for Joan that he had risked imprisonment, disgrace, and even the anger of a king. Few men in medieval history paid such a high price for love, and fewer still remained loyal through every hardship. Joan's children also became important figures in English history. Through their marriages and descendants, Joan's bloodline spread throughout the English nobility. In fact, many later kings and queens of England could trace part of their ancestry back to Joan of Acre. In a remarkable way, her legacy continued to shape the monarchy long after her own lifetime. Meanwhile, England itself entered one of the most difficult periods in its history. King Edward II's reign became increasingly unstable. Conflicts with powerful nobles grew worse. Political alliances collapsed. Eventually, Edward II was forced from the throne, bringing a dramatic end to his reign. Looking back, many historians believe that the unity once held together by King Edward I gradually disappeared after his death. Joan never lived to witness those tragic events. Perhaps that was a blessing. She was remembered by history during a time when hope still existed for England's future. Centuries later, historians began examining medieval records with fresh eyes. Instead of focusing only on kings and battles, they started asking new questions. What role did women play in shaping history? How much influence did royal daughters truly have? What happened behind the walls of castles when official ceremonies had ended? Again and again, Joan's name appeared, not because she ruled, not because she conquered, but because she dared to make a deeply personal decision in a world where personal freedom was almost unknown for royal women. Today, Joan of Acre is often recognized as one of the most fascinating princesses of the Plantagenet dynasty. Her life reminds historians that medieval women were far more influential than earlier generations had assumed. They advised rulers,
They governed estates. They shaped future generations. And sometimes they quietly changed history itself. Perhaps that is the greatest reason Joan's story deserves to be remembered. She reminds us that history is not only created by the people whose names appear in giant monuments. It is also created by those who choose kindness over hatred, truth over convenience, and love over fear. Those choices may seem small in the moment, but over hundreds of years, they become unforgettable. And so, more than 7 centuries after Joan of Acre first opened her eyes in a distant French town, her story still lives on. Not as a legend, not as a myth, but as the true story of a woman whose courage proved that the strongest hearts are often found far from the battlefield.
Every journey leaves behind a destination, and every life leaves behind a legacy. Joan of Acre never imagined that people living more than 700 years after her death would still speak her name. She never expected historians to study her choices. She never expected storytellers to share her life across books, documentaries, and videos. She simply lived according to her conscience. Perhaps that is why her story has endured for so long. History has a way of honoring people who remain true to themselves. Many rulers spent their lives chasing power. Others sought wealth. Some dreamed of conquering the world. Yet time has erased many of their names. Joan sought something much simpler. She wanted a life built on honesty, loyalty, and love. Those simple values proved stronger than crowns, castles, or armies. Today, when historians look back on the Plantagenet dynasty, they see a family filled with powerful rulers, fierce warriors, and dramatic political struggles. But among those famous names stands a princess whose greatest weapon was neither a sword nor a crown. It was her character. She reminded the world that strength is not measured by the number of battles you win. It is measured by the promises you keep, by the people you protect, by the values you refuse to abandon. That message is as meaningful today as it was in the 13th century. The world has changed beyond recognition. Technology has transformed the way we live. Kingdoms have become modern nations. Castles have become museums. But courage, compassion, integrity, and love remain timeless. They connect every generation. Perhaps that is why Joan's story continues to inspire readers and history lovers around the globe. It reminds us that every ordinary day presents extraordinary choices. Every conversation offers an opportunity for kindness. Every challenge presents a chance to show courage. Every decision shapes the legacy we leave behind. You do not have to wear a crown to change someone's life. You do not have to command an army to be remembered. Sometimes the greatest victories happen quietly, inside families, inside friendships, inside moments when no one else is watching. That was Joan of Acre's greatest lesson. As we close this story for the final time, remember this. History is not only about the famous names written in royal records. It is also about people who chose kindness over anger, truth over fear, hope over despair. Those are the stories that never grow old. Thank you for spending these hours exploring the remarkable life of Joan of Acre.
May her courage remind us that the strongest legacy anyone can leave is not found in power or wealth, but in the lives they touch with honesty, compassion, and love. Until our next journey into history, take care. Keep asking questions. Keep discovering the stories hidden beneath the pages of the past. Because history is never just about yesterday. It is a guide for tomorrow.
Joan of Acre never became Queen of England, yet historians continue placing her among the most memorable women of the Plantagenet dynasty, not because she ruled, but because she demonstrated that moral courage can influence history as much as political power. She proved that even a princess living under strict medieval traditions could shape her own destiny. That achievement remains extraordinary, even after 7 centuries.
Although our documentary has reached its final chapters, Joan of Acre's influence did not end with her lifetime. Every generation has its own heroes. Some are remembered for winning wars, others for building great empires, but a select few are remembered because they changed the way people think. Joan belonged to that rare group. Her courage inspired later historians to look beyond the famous kings and generals. She reminded the world that history is also shaped by daughters, wives, mothers, and ordinary people whose quiet decisions leave extraordinary consequences. Today, when historians study the Plantagenet dynasty, Joan is no longer viewed as a minor royal figure. She is recognized as one of the dynasty's most remarkable women. Not because she ruled England, but because she proved that dignity, honesty, and perseverance could triumph over fear. In many ways, Joan's greatest achievement was invisible. She changed hearts before she changed history. She transformed her father's anger into forgiveness. She transformed public criticism into admiration. And she transformed a secret love story into one of medieval England's most inspiring true stories. That kind of victory cannot be measured with crowns or castles. It can only be measured by the generations who continue telling her story. More than 700 years later, we are still talking about Joan of Acre. And perhaps that is the greatest proof that her legacy truly lives on.
Throughout history, the greatest names are often those who wore crowns: kings, queens, emperors, conquerors. Their victories are recorded in books. Their statues stand in public squares. Their names appear in every history lesson. Yet, every so often, history introduces someone who changes the world without ever ruling it. Joan of Acre was one of those rare people. She never became Queen of England. She never commanded an army. She never signed royal laws. Still, her life became a symbol of something much greater than political power. It became a symbol of personal courage. When people think about medieval royalty, they often imagine lives filled with endless luxury. But Joan's story reminds us that even behind palace walls, people struggled with impossible choices: duty or happiness, obedience or honesty, fear or hope. These were the battles Joan fought. And unlike wars fought with swords, these battles were fought within the human heart.
Perhaps that is why her story feels so familiar today. Every generation faces moments when expectations conflict with personal dreams. Sometimes those expectations come from family, sometimes from society, sometimes from our own fears. Joan teaches us that choosing our own path is never easy. But if that choice is made with honesty, respect, and responsibility, it can become a source of lasting strength. Her relationship with Ralph de Montgomery remains one of the most remarkable love stories in medieval English history. It was never built on wealth, never built on political ambition, never built on royal advantage. It was built on trust, and trust survived every obstacle placed before them: imprisonment, public criticism, royal opposition. None of those challenges destroyed what they shared. Instead, each hardship made their bond even stronger. Looking back across more than 7 centuries, historians continue asking why Joan's story remains so memorable. The answer is surprisingly simple: because it feels real. She was not a perfect heroine. She experienced fear. She made difficult decisions. She faced painful consequences. But through every challenge, she remained true to herself. That authenticity has allowed her story to survive long after countless others have faded into history. And perhaps that is the true measure of greatness: not how much power a person holds, but how faithfully they live according to the values they believe in. Joan of Acre never wore England's crown, yet she earned something even lasting: the respect of history itself.
Throughout history, the greatest names are often those who wore crowns: kings, queens, emperors, conquerors. Their victories are recorded in books. Their statues stand in public squares. Their names appear in every history lesson. Yet, every so often, history introduces someone who changes the world without ever ruling it. Joan of Acre was one of those rare people. She never became Queen of England. She never commanded an army. She never signed royal laws. Still, her life became a symbol of something much greater than political power. It became a symbol of personal courage. When people think about medieval royalty, they often imagine lives filled with endless luxury. But Joan's story reminds us that even behind palace walls, people struggled with impossible choices: duty or happiness, obedience or honesty, fear or hope. These were the battles Joan fought. And unlike wars fought with swords, these battles were fought within the human heart. Perhaps that is why her story feels so familiar today. Every generation faces moments when expectations conflict with personal dreams. Sometimes those expectations come from family, sometimes from society, sometimes from our own fears. Joan teaches us that choosing our own path is never easy. But if that choice is made with honesty, respect, and responsibility, it can become a source of lasting strength. Her relationship with Ralph de Montgomery remains one of the most remarkable love stories in medieval English history. It was never built on wealth, never built on political ambition, never built on royal advantage. It was built on trust, and trust survived every obstacle placed before them: imprisonment,
public criticism, royal opposition. None of those challenges destroyed what they shared. Instead, each hardship made their bond even stronger. Looking back across more than 7 centuries, historians continue asking why Joan's story remains so memorable. The answer is surprisingly simple: because it feels real. She was not a perfect heroine. She experienced fear. She made difficult decisions. She faced painful consequences. But through every challenge, she remained true to herself. That authenticity has allowed her story to survive long after countless others have faded into history. And perhaps that is the true measure of greatness, not how much power a person holds, but how faithfully they live according to the values they believe in. Joan of Acre never wore England's crown, yet she earned something even lasting: the respect of history itself.
More than 700 years have passed since Joan of Acre lived. Empires have risen and fallen. New nations have been born. Technology has transformed the world in ways that medieval people could never have imagined. Yet history continues to preserve certain names, not because those people were the most powerful, but because they represented something timeless. Joan is one of those names. When modern historians read medieval chronicles, they do more than record dates and events. They search for the people behind those events. What motivated them? What did they fear? What gave them hope? Joan's life provides answers to those questions. She reminds us that behind every royal title stood a real human being, a daughter who wanted her father's respect, a wife who loved her husband, a mother who wished to protect her children. Those roles mattered far more to Joan than any royal ceremony. Perhaps that is why she continues to feel so relatable today. In many ways, Joan's greatest victory was not winning her father's forgiveness. It was remaining true to herself without losing her compassion for others. She never allowed anger to replace respect. She never allowed disappointment to become hatred. Even during the most difficult moments of her life, she chose dignity over revenge. That choice deserves admiration in every century. Historians also point out another remarkable fact. Joan lived during an age when very few women had the freedom to shape their own futures. Despite those limitations, she managed to influence the course of her own life through patience, intelligence, and determination. She did not change the laws of England. She did something far more personal. She changed her own destiny, and by doing so, she inspired countless people who came after her. Every generation discovers Joan in a different way. Some admire her as a loving wife. Some see her as a devoted daughter. Others remember her as a courageous woman who quietly challenged the expectations of her time. Each interpretation reveals another layer of her remarkable life. Perhaps that is the true power of history. It allows every generation to find new meaning in old stories. Joan's journey may have ended centuries ago, but the questions she faced, the choices she made, and the values she defended still speak to us today. Because true courage never belongs to one century alone. It belongs to anyone willing to stand for what is right, with honesty, patience, and kindness. And that is why Joan of Acre's voice continues to echo through the pages of history.
Every great story eventually reaches its final page.
not because the memories disappear, but because the lessons have been passed on. Joan of Acre's journey began in a distant land, far from the kingdom she would one day call home. She was born into one of the most powerful royal families in Europe. From childhood, her future seemed already written. Others decided where she would live. Others decided whom she would marry. Others planned the path her life should follow. For a time, Joan accepted those expectations. She fulfilled her duties. She honored her family. She served her kingdom with dignity. But when destiny offered her a second chance after the death of her first husband, she made the most important decision of her life. She chose love. That single decision changed everything. It brought conflict. It brought heartache. It brought uncertainty. Yet it also brought happiness that no political alliance could ever provide. Joan paid a high price for following her heart. She watched her husband imprisoned. She lost her lands. She faced the anger of one of the most powerful kings in Europe. Still, she never denied the truth. She never abandoned the man she loved. And in the end, her honesty achieved what force never could. It changed her father's heart. That victory was not won on a battlefield. It was won through patience, through courage, through unwavering faith in what she believed was right. Perhaps that is why Joan's story still speaks to us after more than 7 centuries. Every one of us faces moments when the easy path and the right path are not the same. Those moments define who we become. Joan reminds us that real courage is not the absence of fear. It is choosing to do what you believe is right despite that fear. Her life also teaches us something about forgiveness. King Edward I could have spent the rest of his life punishing his daughter. Instead, he chose reconciliation. Joan could have answered anger with bitterness. Instead, she answered it with respect. Because of those choices, a broken family became whole again. That lesson remains just as meaningful today as it was in medieval England. As we close this remarkable journey, Joan of Acre should be remembered not simply as an English princess, not simply as the daughter of King Edward I, and not simply as the wife of Ralph de Monthermer. She should be remembered as a woman who proved that kindness can be stronger than power, that honesty can overcome fear, and that love, when guided by integrity, can leave a legacy that outlives kingdoms. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life of one of medieval England's most extraordinary women. If you enjoyed this story and would like to explore more fascinating tales from history, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who love discovering the remarkable people hidden within the pages of history. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and remember, history is not only the story of kings and queens, it is the story of ordinary human choices that become extraordinary through courage. Thank you for watching.
Before we end this journey completely, there is one final chapter worth exploring. What happened to the people Joan left behind? History continued after her death, and the lives of those closest to her took very different paths. Her husband, Ralph de Monthermer, continued serving the English crown for many years. Although he later married, historians believe Joan remained the defining love of his life. After all, it was for Joan that he had risked imprisonment, disgrace, and even the anger of a king.
Few men in medieval history paid such a high price for love, and fewer still remained loyal through every hardship. Joan's children also became important figures in English history. Through their marriages and descendants, Joan's bloodline spread throughout the English nobility. In fact, many later kings and queens of England could trace part of their ancestry back to Joan of Acre. In a remarkable way, her legacy continued to shape the monarchy long after her own lifetime. Meanwhile, England itself entered one of the most difficult periods in its history. King Edward II's reign became increasingly unstable. Conflicts with powerful nobles grew worse. Political alliances collapsed. Eventually, Edward II was forced from the throne, bringing a dramatic end to his reign. Looking back, many historians believe that the unity once held together by King Edward I gradually disappeared after his death. Joan never lived to witness those tragic events. Perhaps that was a blessing. She was remembered by history during a time when hope still existed for England's future. Centuries later, historians began examining medieval records with fresh eyes. Instead of focusing only on kings and battles, they started asking new questions. What role did women play in shaping history? How much influence did royal daughters truly have? What happened behind the walls of castles when official ceremonies had ended? Again and again, Joan's name appeared, not because she ruled, not because she conquered, but because she dared to make a deeply personal decision in a world where personal freedom was almost unknown for royal women. Today, Joan of Acre is often recognized as one of the most fascinating princesses of the Plantagenet dynasty. Her life reminds historians that medieval women were far more influential than earlier generations had assumed. They advised rulers, they governed estates, they shaped future generations, and sometimes they quietly changed history itself. Perhaps that is the greatest reason Joan's story deserves to be remembered. She reminds us that history is not only created by the people whose names appear in giant monuments. It is also created by those who choose kindness over hatred, truth over convenience, and love over fear. Those choices may seem small in the moment, but over hundreds of years, they become unforgettable. And so, more than 7 centuries after Joan of Acre first opened her eyes in a distant French town, her story still lives on. Not as a legend, not as a myth, but as the true story of a woman whose courage proved that the strongest hearts are often found far from the battlefield.
As our documentary reaches its closing moments, one final thought remains. What does it truly mean to leave a legacy? For many rulers, legacy is measured by the lands they conquered. For great generals, it is measured by the battles they won. For wealthy nobles, it is measured by castles, treasures, and titles. But Joan of Acre left behind a different kind of legacy, one that cannot be counted, one that cannot be built from stone. She left behind an example of courage without violence, an example of love without selfishness, an example of strength without cruelty. That is why historians continue speaking her name. When students first discover Joan's story, they are often surprised.
They expect another tale of political ambition or royal conflict. Instead, they find a woman who valued honesty above power, who believed loyalty mattered more than status, who proved that a single act of courage could echo across centuries. Her life reminds us that greatness is not reserved for those who wear crowns. Sometimes, greatness belongs to those who quietly refuse to abandon their principles. Joan never sought fame. She never imagined that future generations would study her life. She simply chose to live according to her conscience. Ironically, that humility became one of the greatest reasons history remembered her. Even today, scholars continue discovering new details about medieval England through records connected to Joan and her family. Each document adds another small piece to the puzzle. Each discovery reminds us that history is always evolving. There is always another question to ask, another mystery to explore, another story waiting to be told. Perhaps that is why Joan's journey feels so timeless. It encourages us to look beyond famous battles and royal ceremonies. It encourages us to see history as the story of real people. People who laughed, people who struggled, people who made mistakes, people who found the courage to keep moving forward despite uncertainty. Those are the stories that connect the past with the present. As we say goodbye to Joan of Acre, let us remember her not simply as an English princess, not simply as the daughter of King Edward I, but as a woman whose quiet determination proved that character can outlast kingdoms. Centuries from now, castles may continue to weather under wind and rain. Ancient walls may slowly crumble, but the values Joan lived by, honor, loyalty, compassion, and unwavering courage, will never grow old, because those are the qualities that make history worth remembering, and they are the qualities that continue to inspire the world today.